No fame. Just a fortune.
Before 1800, more people came to America from Africa than from anywhere else on Earth.
Slavery was no sideshow in American history. It was the main event.
America was a slave-owning country longer than it has been a free one. And the legacy of slavery haunts us still.
We've made certain progress in race relations, but we'll never get further until we look more closely at slavery.
This is a story of resistance and the struggle to maintain human dignity. It is a story of the demand for freedom told through the lives of enslaved people. And it's the story of the founding fathers you never knew. They were from Africa and Europe. Some were enslaved, some were indentured servants. All of them were poor and exploited. Their status as workers was confusing and complex. Their lives were controlled by the Dutch West India Company. Day after day, they struggled to survive the harsh world of Dutch New Amsterdam in the 1620s. Evening after evening, they gathered in taverns.
Taverns were places where you gathered to talk about your problems. And slaves would complain about their masters, and indentured servants would complain about their masters. So they had a lot of interracial bonding in these taverns.
You have people who indenture themselves. They promise their labor to a wealthy person for 7 years in order to pay off the price of coming to the New World.
The Dutch West India Company had established a fur trading post in 1624 on a hilly island called Manhattis. The area would become New York City. Less than 200 people lived in the settlement. Most were men from Northern Europe who worked for the company. To make larger profits, the Dutch West India Company wanted free labor. Free Africans had come to the New World with European explorers in the 1530s. English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia purchased 20 Africans from Dutch traders in 1619. 5 years later, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Dutch New Amsterdam. Their bondage began approximately 200 years of slavery in what would become America's northern states.
The first 11 enslaved people, all male, who came to New Amsterdam were brought by the Dutch West India Company. They were owned by the company, not by individuals. So they're company slaves, and they're brought by the company for the purpose of building the colony.
It was quite common for the Dutch and for the English to raid the wealthier Spanish and the Portuguese shipping to get people and to get property. So these people really are, in a sense, prisoners of war.
These people come out of a larger Atlantic world in the 14th and 15th century as Africa, Europe, and the Americas meet for the first time. We call them Atlantic Creoles.
Atlantic Creoles had cultural roots in both Africa and Europe. Some were the offspring of European men and African women. Some traveled the seas with Europeans. Some may have been literate. Many spoke multiple languages.
The names of the first 11 indicate some of that mixture. The names Simon Congo, or Anthony Portuguese, or John d'Angola. These names are European names, Simon, Anthony, John, they're Christian names. And then the last names, Portuguese, indicating a connection with Portugal, perhaps with a Portuguese explorer, or Congo, indicating this is a Christian African who came from the Congo.
The enslaved did not know if or when freedom would come. In the settlements of Virginia, Massachusetts, and New Amsterdam, slavery was undefined. There were no laws, no rules, no regulations.
It was a difficult, hard life. They are expected to work regardless of the weather, regardless of the temperature, because their work is what was valuable, not their person.
Work began at sunrise. The company forced the first 11 to clear land, construct roads, and unload ships. They were both manual and skilled workers. Their labor helped build the Dutch New Amsterdam economy.
The first 11 slaves were there really to provide the infrastructure. So they were really the backbone of this early colony and really were integral to the survival of Europeans.
Because the Dutch did fear racial mixture, they were not interested in marriages between Creoles and Dutch women or Belgian women. Therefore, by the late 1620s, they brought in Creole or African women into the colony.
The women are ostensibly brought, as the company says, for the comfort of our Negro men. They will need to perform at least 2 jobs, which is to be sexual partners for the men, but to be hard workers as well. The men are going to be very important then in helping these women navigate, since the men have been there for slightly longer than the women and understand the terrain.
Slaves in New Amsterdam during this time have rights that we think of as unusual for enslaved people, those wages.
Slavery had no legal structure. The Atlantic Creoles were able to negotiate for greater autonomy. In 1635, several of them petitioned the Dutch West India Company for wages they believed the company owed them. Anthony Portuguese sued a white merchant in 1638. A year later, Pedro Negreto and Manuel de Rue successfully sued Europeans for wages due. Court records indicate that Atlantic Creoles made the system work for them when they could.
In some African slavery, there is a greater sense of the rights of the enslaved people. There's a greater sense of obligation on the part of the community. And I think that these enslaved people bring that idea of slavery with them.
In 1641, Anthony van Angola, one of the first 11, married Lucy de Angola. It was the first recorded marriage between black people in Dutch New Amsterdam.
The enslaved understand legitimating a marriage is a way to claim ground. They are sophisticated interpreters of the landscape.
In Europeans' religious beliefs, you were not supposed to enslave another Christian, and African people knew this and attempted to convert to Christianity. So Christianity was this space that Africans tried to build into a space of negotiation for greater freedom. Now, in reality, many enslaved people were Christian, and the fact that they were baptized and were practicing Christians meant nothing in terms of their status as a free people.
The Dutch West India Company has a very problematic relationship with the area Native Americans. By 1639, relations had deteriorated into war. At that point, a number of the Creoles are put into the military force against the Indians.
There is a fear among Europeans during this time that African Americans may join with Native Americans. And the first 11, in fact, used this fear to negotiate.
They had been part of the Reformed Church, they had served in the military, they had built the fort, they had done all of the critical labor that was necessary to make New Amsterdam into a viable town. Now, it was their time to be free.
The company responded with what has become known as half-freedom. These men and their wives could live on what became known as the free Negro lots. They could farm their own land, and they paid a kind of tribute in return to the company. The company also had the right to call them up if they needed their labor.
Don't get the idea that these were just nice people and wanted to allow these Africans an opportunity. They calculated they could make more money with half freedom, and therefore they used that system. But even under those conditions, work in the Dutch colonies for a slave was slavery.
The members of this community of half-free people had to be very profoundly struck with the tentative and tenuous nature of their freedom. The evidence of that is their children, who are not half-free, who remain enslaved, and therefore, in a very profound way, speak to the fact that the community itself is vulnerable.
Half-free blacks don't separate themselves from enslaved blacks. In fact, they work at times to try and negotiate freedom for other enslaved people. Over the years, these 11 men and their wives continue to bargain, petition for freedom for their children.
New Amsterdam is now becoming a good-sized town. At least 20% of the people are black. Some of them are slaves, some are half-free, some are free, but wherever you are in that spectrum, you can see the possibilities.
Half-freedom is this moment where a group of slaves has moved to a new status, and there's probably a belief among the people in the slave community that they too can achieve a new status. Not perfect, not full freedom, but something better and more autonomous than what had existed before.
Freedom was also the goal of black and white indentured servants in Chesapeake Tobacco Country. Since the early 1600s, black people had trickled into the area. Most were enslaved, others indentured servants. A few were free. John Punch was a black indentured servant. James Gregory, a Scotsman, and Victor, from the Netherlands, served with him on a small tobacco farm.
In the New World, every European colony needed to provide a profit. In the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, Maryland, the more tobacco you could plant, the more profits you could reap, the more pleased the investors back in England would be. And there is tremendous pressure for labor.
They hoped to use Native Americans that they found in Virginia as a labor supply. They were disappointed because the Native Americans in Virginia were powerful enough to frustrate the attempts to use them as forced laborers. It was at that point that the British turned to British laborers under the indentured servitude system.
The status of indentured white servants and indentured Africans was very similar. They were both, of course, hired for a period of time, and both could become free. And let's also say that both were treated real bad. To be an indentured servant in this country meant that you literally didn't have any rights.
In this world, there's not much practical difference in terms of the oppression that they face. In some measure, that equality is an equality because these people can't be treated worse.
By 1640, indentured servants were essential to the profits of Virginia tobacco farmers. Their labor made tobacco the colony's most profitable export.
Three men on the same farm, doing the same labor, being harassed and oppressed on a comparable level, to the point that these three men chose to flee their owner.
John Punch, Victor, and James Gregory crossed the Virginia border into southern Maryland. Days later, they were captured and returned.
Plaintiff, please step forward. Take place. My lord, I ask your punishment against these indentured servants.
In the colony's highest court, it was said that Hugh Gwynn's servants caused him considerable loss and prejudice.
I want you to punish them, my lord. You will serve 3 more years.
The 2 white men are sentenced to simply a number of years added to their indentures. For John Punch, the one black among these 3 men, his fate is infinitely worse. It's servitude for life.
For the rest of your life.
Now, there's no law that says that John Punch had to have been enslaved for life, but it was clear that 1640 is sort of the turning point, the beginning of the point where Africans are going to be treated differently as opposed to whites who are indentured servants.
Rather than distinguishing people because they are unfree, people are being distinguished now because they're black or white, and that whiteness is privileging in ever increasing and beneficial ways.
Emanuel Drigas first appears in the records of the Eastern Shore of Virginia in about 1645 as the slave of Captain Francis Pott. Emanuel Drigas fits nicely into the category of people that we are coming to call Atlantic Creoles. He had this European name, Portuguese really. Drigas is just an anglicization or a shortened form of Rodriguez.
As part of Emanuel's servitude, Captain Pott provided him with a cow and a calf. When Emanuel began his service, his wife Frances and daughters, ages 8 and 1, were bound to Captain Pott as well. Captain Pott informed the court, "I have taken to service 2 daughters of my Negro, Emanuel Drigas, to serve and be with me." The terms of Emanuel's enslavement guaranteed that these children would attain their freedom after a specified number of years. However, no such provision was made for their brothers and sisters.
Captain Pott ran into some financial difficulties. He instructed his nephew to try to arrange things to get him out of debt and told him particularly that he would rather part with anything other than his Negroes.
Yet in 1657, after 12 years of service, Emanuel's family became Captain Pott's way to arrange things.
Their family is completely disrupted, in fact destroyed, by Potts's economic insecurities. So that when Potts accrues debt, their younger child is sold. And later their oldest daughter, Anne, is sold for about 5,000 pounds of tobacco.
When Captain Pott died, his widow inherited a farm, farm animals, and Emanuel. However, by 1661, court records show that Emanuel had attained his freedom, leased 145 acres, and expanded his livestock holdings.
Even if you get your freedom, as a black person, your life is not going to be like that of a free white person. Emanuel Drigas gets his freedom. He leases land. He's got to pay many times what a white person would have paid to lease that land. He is not treated like your average free person. Race is really by now a factor and becoming a more and more significant factor.
By 1665, Maryland and New York had legalized slavery. 3 years earlier, Virginia lawmakers decreed, "All children born in Virginia shall be held bond or free according to the condition of the mother."
Even children of, say, a white master and a slave woman, it makes those children not free, it makes them slave. It makes them chattel, it makes them valuable. It makes the white father a slave owner of his own children.
Black men and black women raised thousands of mulatto children as families. That love of children transcended the pain and the horror of how that child was created. Unlike some Europeans who created these children and saw their lives so meaningless and insignificant that they sold them no differently than any other slave.
Emmanuel Drigas continued to see to the needs of his enslaved children. He transferred title to livestock to them later on, hoping, against hope, that the livestock might be a source for some route to freedom for them.
The court records of September 29, 1673 state, I, Emmanuel, grant unto my said 2 daughters 1 bay mare. The same day he granted another mare to his free children. Despite his efforts, Emmanuel could not free Thomas and Anne, the son and daughter sold by Captain Pott. However, because Thomas married a free black woman, his children were born free.
One of those children was named Frances, born in about 1677. Though she was free, she was bound out to serve a local blacksmith planter named John Brewer.
Frances entered the service of the blacksmith in 1694. Later that year, she found herself in court, charged by John Brewer with the sin of fornication. No partner was named. 17-year-old Frances was sentenced to 30 lashes. In addition, her servitude to Brewer was extended for 2 years. Months later, Frances was back in court, this time charged with having a child out of wedlock.
It becomes increasingly difficult for free blacks to make their case before a court of law. Frances Drigas accuses her master of fathering her child. Now, the court won't hear of this. They will not take the word of a black woman against that of a white man, and especially a white man who is a planter.
This throws the court into an uproar. The justices decide to send the case on to a higher level. However, they do sentence her to yet another whipping. Her master, John Brewer, decides he's had enough of Frances and assigns her to another man. Frances brings a court case against this move.
Judges were still unlikely to accept the testimony of a black woman against a white man. Undeterred, Frances argued that Brewer was conspiring to place her in a community where her status as a free woman would not be recognized. The letter binding Frances to Brewer was ruled invalid.
Frances actually wins her suit, and she's released from the terms of her indenture. Frances is really extraordinary because there are very few black women who are able to use the courts in the way that she does. Unfortunately, her father has died, her mother is sick, and by 1700, Frances is impoverished and destitute. She reappears in the courts because, in a desperate act, she steals food to try to feed herself and her child.
She decides that she'd better link up to another household again, become a servant, have some steady kind of support, so she binds over herself and her children to Isaac and Bridget Foxcroft. She promises to serve them for 10 years, and any children that she has are to serve for 25 years.
Now, if you were a free black woman, what are you going to do? There were very few means of making money for any woman in the colony. To be free, ironically, meant that you were going to be impoverished. And in fact, you could find yourself worse off than someone who was enslaved.
Isaac Foxcroft had promised Francis freedom upon his death. However, when he died, his widow assigned Francis and her children to another master. Again, Francis sought justice. Without a document, and only her word for evidence, the court ruled against her. After 1704, she disappeared from the public record.
In Virginia and a number of other colonies, the Atlantic Creoles knew how to negotiate their way through this system and win gains and advantages for themselves. Limited gains sometimes, but gains nonetheless. It had gone from a situation where they could do that to a situation where there was no space left to do that.
The small group of elite Virginia planters have committed to the use of race slavery to expand their tobacco holdings. In 1691, they forbid free blacks from living in certain counties. If you're African American, you cannot have an education. You cannot move about freely. You cannot hold property. All of these constraints are falling in on one generation.
It's a link in a chain of slavery whereby people cannot become free. Before this, there were ways of becoming free.
Slavery is replacing indentured servitude as the labor system of choice, and by the beginning of the 18th century, it is clear that through law in the Chesapeake, slavery is being made a racially based institution, and people are being considered property.
New Amsterdam was renamed New York in 1664 after the British took over the colony. New York and other British colonies, including Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Maryland, were societies with slaves. Of the original 13 colonies, Carolina was the first in which slavery was the center of economic production, making it the first slave society. Racial slavery was sanctioned by Carolina's 1669 Constitution.
The Carolina colony, which was originally South Carolina and North Carolina, was founded about 1670. It's one of these gifts from Charles II to his friends. Here's a place to exploit, fellas, go to it.
Many South Carolinian whites came initially from Barbados, where the British had established a giant sugar economy with some 50,000 Afro-Caribbean slaves. The plantation system was merely transplanted, like a kind of virus, from the Caribbean to the American coast.
The more slaves that you brought gave you more land. You got 50 acres of land for every person that you brought into the Carolina colony. And so slavery was encouraged from the outset here. And of course, the key was to find the type of work that slaves could do to make the colony profitable.
As the enslaved cleared land, the planters searched for a way to exploit the Carolina Low Country. They tried growing cotton and indigo and raising livestock. The more they tried, the more they failed to find a lucrative cash crop. The enslaved were growing something they called oriza, or rice, for themselves. They had grown it for hundreds of years in West Africa.
Now, it's not knowledge that they hold to themselves. Once they have shown other people how to plant this crop, they've lost control of the knowledge. And an entire economy based on exploitation of Africans is in place within a generation. And the shipment of Africans to South Carolina skyrockets.
So many of the Africans who were enslaved during the 17th and 18th century were ex-soldiers. Some of them would be captured through wars or civil wars. And these victors would sell the captives off to the Europeans. This had the advantage from their point of view of reducing their numerical strength, especially the soldier population of the opponents.
Their march to the coast. Many of them had not been to the coast before. They had not seen the ocean. They see white people for the first time. Who are these people? There was this folklore about cannibalism. Lots of slaves who were brought to the coast really were so afraid that these people were going to eat them.
Some of the people owning South Carolina are also invested in the Royal Africa Company and the slave trade themselves. They're getting a profit at both ends out of this.
The major profit came from the human cargo of enslaved Africans. slave trading had become the basis of an international economy.
There are a variety of auxiliary industries, that is shipbuilding, insuring those ships, making sales for those ships. So the expansion of slavery then is an essential part of the expansion of capitalism.
As the ships came from West Africa and people were dying, their bodies would be thrown overboard, usually in the middle of the Atlantic. But once in a while, the captains would wait until they arrived at Charleston Harbor. So one of these captains threw several dozen overboard. And their bodies, including children, began to wash ashore. So the governor became very upset. And it wasn't because this was a crime against humanity. It was because the smell was irritating to the white population.
In many African communities, there's this reverence for the ancestors and this reverence for those who are now in the spirit world, a belief that they are watching over. And I think that that is what sustains so many people at their weakest and their lowest moment.
On Sullivan's Island, the English established a pest house where they could quarantine people off of incoming ships.
These people were thought of as goods, as cargo. And in the language of the slave trader, this was a place where goods were held until they could reach full market value. This is the perfect example of the inhumanity of the slave system.
The most valuable workers were men younger than 20. And the second most valuable were women younger than 20. Children were young and inexpensive, and they would grow up and live a long time and produce a lot of rice.
For a person just arriving, you know you've been aboard this ship for a long time, but you probably don't know exactly how long. You don't know where you have gone. Of course, the number one thing on your mind is, how do I get out of here? How do I get myself free?
Those who died were probably buried in mass graves. The people who had died en route were probably 1/4 to 1/3 of those who had actually boarded the ship. Those who finally survived were taken to Charleston, where they were waxed down with oil, fed a good meal, and then put on the auction block.
For the enslaved, survival took many forms. Some pretended to be ignorant or represented their master's interests. However, many refused to conform. They maintained their dignity by drawing strength from their spirituality and culture.
Even though people may not have spoken the same language, and even though people may have been rivals traditionally in their homelands, there would have been a certain spiritual bonding that took place, that people came together and fused themselves together in this new world.
By the 1720s, enslaved black people outnumbered whites by more than 2 to 1 in the Carolina Low Country.
Slavery was probably unique in every region where it flourished. Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and Barbados. But in South Carolina, it was probably the most industrial form of slavery because the scale was so great. The task system was something that was unique to South Carolina, whereby enslaved people had a given assignment on each day. So they usually went to work in the morning at sunrise, and a day's task in the field would be to hoe 1/4 of an acre, which was 105 feet square. and people spent most of the year up to their knees in mud, bent over, tilling away at the soil under the sun. Rice was a very demanding master.
In South Carolina, slaves are worked almost to death, and then they go back to Africa and they go get some more, and they are continually replenished.
In Central Africa, men generally don't do agricultural work. There's even a proverb: if you want to humiliate another man, you say, "You're no man, take up a hoe," indicating that only women would do this kind of work. And yet here in South Carolina, men were being forced to work right alongside of women.
In West Africa, the mother would pound a little bit of rice every day to prepare the evening meal. It was an art form. It was a skill. You could be proud of it. You then found yourself doing the same thing. You're growing rice, but now it's completely different.
Boy, I call you. Boy, I call you.
The sound of the pounding of rice in Africa was the sound of domesticity, but the sound of pounding rice in South Carolina was the sound of exploitation.
Well, the more money that the white elite made, the more it was in their interest to make the slave system a kind of invincible fortress that would perpetuate the comforts of the few. And so the incentive was, for those who ran the society, to set up extensive policing systems.
A slave, especially under these circumstances, wants to survive, wants to be free. And it also doesn't take much imagination to understand the anger of being enslaved, of being held against your will, seeing your loved one subjected to treatment that no human beings ought to experience.
The first time, your punishment was whipping. If you ran away a second time, there would be an R branded on your right cheek. The third time, one of your ears would be severed, and another R would be burned onto your left cheek for runaway. And if you ran away a fourth time, if you were a man, the punishment was castration.
Gruesome punishments that had been familiar in England were exaggerated in the slave society. The planter had to calculate that I can punish this person even if they die. I can import new people from West Africa, and I'm making so much money in this process that I can afford to do it.
The inhumane treatment says a lot. That indeed they're resisting their enslavement, that like any other human being whose rights and opportunities are being taken away, that they're going to resist and fight back.
Burning down barns was something that occurred regularly and increased during harvest time when the workload was heaviest. Poisoning could not be caught readily, and it was often something that was feared by whites even when it didn't exist.
One symptom of their fear was that there was a law that white men had to carry guns when they went to church. Sunday was the only day off for enslaved people. And so the white folks feared that the uprising, if it ever came, would happen on Sunday when all the whites were gathered in church. Therefore, the white men were required to carry their guns to church.
It was on a Saturday night, September 1739. It was a work crew. Many of them are Angolans, including a man named Jemmy, who becomes the leader.
The fated Sunday finally came on the Stono River, southwest of Charleston. and they got to a store and broke in and they killed a Mr. Hutchinson, decapitated him and put his head on a pole and cleared out his store of guns.
It happens in harvest time, which is the time when blacks are being worked the hardest. It also happens in malaria time, and there is an epidemic going on in Charleston, which has virtually shut down the town.
They must have realized that they couldn't possibly take over the area and drive out the Europeans. But they did recognize the possibility that if they took common action as soldiers, they might be able to escape.
The governor of Florida had already issued a decree that any African who was a slave who made it to Florida would be free, and there was indeed a colony there of ex-slaves.
There is this African manned fortification, and when the Stonewall Rebellion breaks out, it becomes clear that what these people are trying to do is to reach Fort Mose.
People begin to join them. They burn successive plantations, kill some of the white people living there, draw some of the blacks with them. Others are afraid to join in and refuse to go. But unfortunately for them, they meet the lieutenant governor riding north.
They gave chase to him, but he was able to sound the alarm, and then of course a sort of a posse is formed, and they set out after this group of Africans.
It's an amazing moment. If they had been able to take him hostage, who knows what the dynamics would have been. These people are pursued south for a day or two. If they had been able to go another 24 or 48 hours so that more people could have joined them, their strength would have been greater, and who knows what the prospects would have been.
And the whites came on them. They surrounded these men and they fired on them. A lot of them were scattered. Many of them were killed.
Some of them escaped into the swamp, but those that they did capture, they chopped their heads off and put their heads on poles leading out down what is today US 17 out of Charleston to send a message to the other Africans. This is what will happen to you if you rebel.
After the Stonewall Rebellion, all of the separate laws governing slavery were consolidated into a single code. This black code restricted the movement of black people and regulated almost every aspect of the lives of the enslaved.
The laws were called Black Codes. The aim was slavery without the chain.
The Black Codes were laws passed to control and restrict and constrain the lives of the freed people, essentially rendering them bondsmen again under law.
Some states made it illegal for freedmen to handle weapons and restricted them from buying or renting land. Black children could be seized from poor families and forced to work in the fields. If a black man had no job, he could be jailed and auctioned to a planter for his labor.
They make a travesty of the freedom that African Americans have acquired. They are so far from any notion of fairness or freedom that even Northerners who are not egalitarians say these laws are unacceptable.
New York City, 1741. Quack, enslaved to a house painter, approached Fort George, the seat of British colonial rule in New York, and home to the governor.
Quack was married to the governor's cook, a slave. The governor did not like Quack's behavior and did not like when Quack came visiting. And the governor gave orders to the Fort sentries that if Quack should appear, he should not be allowed entry. Quack uttered certain imprecations that he would burn the place down, but he would be with his wife. When the fort did subsequently burn down, Quack was a prime suspect.
When fires erupted in a number of other buildings, warehouses, and stores, it was clear that this was more than romance thwarted.
The cry went up, the Negroes are rising, the Negroes are rising.
Rumors of slaves organizing rebellion traveled the Atlantic seaboard. 2 years earlier, in an uprising of slaves in Stono, South Carolina, some whites were murdered. Now, white New Yorkers panicked.
Almost every adult black male who was over 14 years of age was picked up by the city constables, by the militia, and placed in jail.
As the inquiries began, Caesar, slave of a baker, was the first to be marched to the gallows. His body would hang in a public space while a conspiracy trial accused dozens of slaves and a few whites of plotting to burn down New York City and foment slave rebellion. The trial revealed bitter details about the lives of the enslaved in New York, home to the second largest slave population after Charleston, South Carolina.
There was a sense among all of these slaves that they were trapped into a system that offered no yield at all, that there was nothing that they could do if they wanted to be free except to revolt.
Slaves complained about being overworked and that they weren't supplied with enough clothing or fuel to keep warm. They lashed out at the laws that prohibited them from gathering together. But their most common complaint was not being allowed to visit their loved ones.
In the mid-18th century, African Americans in New York knew that liberty existed for others. They knew it was denied to them.
As slaves faced the court, they were confronted by all the laws that had accumulated over the past 100 years, restricting and degrading their lives.
The law of slavery deemed that persons who were patently human beings were not in fact persons. They were not persons at law. Rather, they were deemed property. Well, that is a patent fiction. Anyone can look at Caesar, at Quack, and say, well, yes, these are persons. And much of slaves' existence was geared to the fact of demonstrating their humanity.
Early in the proceedings, Quack was accused of burning down Fort George. He and 12 other black men were burned at the stake. 17 were hanged. 4 whites were also hanged.
After each rebellion, what the society seeks to do is pass a more repressive set of laws. And so we have a continually upward cycling of violence, because the violence of slaveholder repression produces the violence of slave reaction.
By the 1750s, some 5,000 Africans a year were brought to American docks in crowded, filthy, stinking ships.
And for weeks, they are confined to these places. People being chained together. People dying and being chained to dead people for periods of time until somebody decides to take the dead people above decks and throw them into the ocean.
Some people didn't last 2 weeks, but for other people, they began mustering the human resources that it would take to figure out the predicament they had been thrown into. The planters, the exploiters, have rationalized what they're doing. They've worked it out with the law. They've worked it out with their God one way or another. And they've begun the long trek into American racism. That is to say, they have reduced these people to less than human beings, and that's the way they're going to make it work.
100 years after the first Africans arrived, most colonies were heavily dependent upon slave labor. By 1750, 250,000 enslaved blacks now made vast wealth possible for their masters. By 1750, 250,000 enslaved blacks
Slavery, it seems to me, was an extraordinary goose that laid the golden egg. You had workers that you didn't have to pay, and you owned their children as soon as they were born. It's a preposterous system. All you have to do is visit one of the huge plantations in Virginia or South Carolina to see the wealth that flowed.
At Shadwell, a tobacco plantation in the Piedmont region of Virginia, 2 young boys are growing up together. Jupiter was born a slave. The other, Thomas Jefferson, would one day be president of a new republic. Jupiter was one of more than 60 slaves who sustained Jefferson's family.
A new generation of black people, of slaves, is coming of age. These are people who are born on this side of the Atlantic. These are people who know how to operate within the society.
When Thomas Jefferson went off to study the classics, Jupiter was trained to be Jefferson's personal valet. That training would include sophisticated lessons in psychology and power.
Certainly, as he grew up, one of the things that he was going to have to learn is that a boy who is his same age, Thomas Jefferson, is going to grow up to be his owner, is going to grow up to be his master.
He came to understand something about the politics of that world. The word liberty, of course, would come to be used much in the years that followed, and his own owner, Thomas Jefferson, became a great merchant of the language of liberty. Jupiter understood that as well.
Jupiter's status and work conditions were privileged compared to most other slaves at Shadwell. But for all of them, including Jupiter, it would be endless work from sunup to sundown and beyond.
All of them also would have experienced a punishment. The cutting off of ears, the kind of contraptions that are placed around people to prevent running away. All of these torturous weapons are realities that enslaved people everywhere would have experienced.
Jupiter, like any child, would also have to deal with the fact that while his parents have authority over him, their authority is secondary to the authority of the slave owner. He might have to witness his mother being schooled by her owner. He would have to watch his mother being punished, being whipped, or being raped.
In this lopsided balance of power, slaves found ingenious ways to resist the master. Some subtle, some overt, some suicidal.
Arson was one of the primary forms of resistance because it was hard to track. Poisoning was another. Running away was another, because you were literally stealing property from the master if you ran away.
A runaway ad in 1746 describes 16-year-old Stephen thusly. He has been much whipped, which his back will show. Another ad describes Peter as Virginia-born, running away with iron shackles on his legs.
Day after day, slaves are refusing to obey. They are saying, listen, we have our own lives. We will not go that far. We will not submit totally.
Slave and master knew each other well. Using this familiarity, slaves constantly tested the boundaries. They negotiated with their masters for more time to work on their own gardens or to sell and trade produce they cultivated.
It would seem that somebody who's a slave would have no power and would have nothing to negotiate. But slaves found that they could negotiate. They danced the dance of domination and subordination.
One of the most profound forms of resistance was the preservation of African religions, values, and beliefs.
What it did is create an internal universe, which is separate and apart from and beyond the control of a white master.
It was 1775. The American Revolution had begun. Some 500,000, or 1 in 5 people in the colonies, were of African descent. Most were enslaved. Some were free. A few even owned slaves themselves. As the relationship between the colonists and the British deteriorated, black people in America faced a new challenge: how to make their demands for freedom heard in the growing cacophony for liberty. In rural Massachusetts, a domestic slave by the name of Mum Bet was paying close attention to this unfolding crisis. She worked alongside her sister, Lizzie, in the home of John and Hannah Ashley.
Colonel John Ashley was probably the most important man in town. The Ashleys owned just about everything there was to own, including, as it turned out, Mum Bet herself.
One day, an incident occurred that would strengthen Mum Bet's resolve.
Lizzie was making for herself some wheat cakes from the scraps that were left over, and Mum Bet is watching from the other side of the room. When Mrs. Ashley sees this and gets furious, she takes a coal pan from the fireplace, a red-hot device that she's ready to bring down on little Lizzie's head. Well, Mum Bet, of course, would never sit for that. She gets the coal pan on her own forearm, and it burns her severely and leaves a nasty scar. Well, for years afterwards, Mumbet made a point of rolling up her sleeves whenever she was in public so that she would reveal the scar, so that when people would ask her, "Why, Betty, what happened?" she would say, "Ask Madam."
Mumbet would soon take her destiny into her own hands. Deprived of an opportunity to learn how to read and write, Mumbet was listening in on the growing resentment of the colonists against British taxation and control. She was present during crucial meetings in the Ashley House when a position paper was written demanding rights for the colonists.
In it, they used the phrase, or something very close to, every citizen is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words that come down from the philosopher John Locke and become part of the scriptural language of the Declaration of Independence. She would have been right there. She would have heard it.
Revolution and the rhetoric of liberty were in the air. Mumbet and others like her would soon begin to exhale this new language.
The natural liberty of man is to be free.
Beginning in 1765 with the Stamp Act crisis, the language, the rhetoric of natural rights flows throughout the American colonies.
God who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time.
There are continual pamphlets that are coming forward to express views of natural rights. Slaves hear that conversation. Slaves, some of them, read those pamphlets.
All men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which when they enter into space.
You know, when you listen to the patriots, they say, we will not be the slaves of England. They don't say we will not be the second-class citizens. They don't say we won't be the oppressed people. They say we will not be the slaves. Well, when people who hold slaves say we will not be slaves, you know that they know what they're talking about. Well, slaves were saying exactly the same thing. And African Americans were quick to say, we will not be the slaves of England, nor will we be the slaves of America.
In early 1773, a petition arrived on the desk of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, the British Crown's representative in Massachusetts. At a time when most slaves were illiterate, this petition was signed by a slave.
The humble petition of many slaves. We shall never be able to possess and enjoy anything, not even life itself, but in a manner as the beasts that perish. We have no property. We have no city, no country. Signed, Felix.
3 months later, another petition was written and signed by 4 enslaved men: Peter Bestus, Sambo Freeman, Justa Joy, and Felix Holbrook.
We expect great things from men who have made such a noble stand against the designs of their fellow men to enslave them.
The petitioners demanded answers.
How is it that you can talk about liberty as a fundamental right of human beings when, in fact, you keep us as slaves? How is it that you treat us as beasts when we are human beings? More than that, they say, how can you call yourself a Christian people?
A year later, yet another petition reached the new Massachusetts governor. Crafted by slaves, the words again would sound like a document that had yet to be written: the Declaration of Independence.
We have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms without being deprived of them by our fellow men.
All the petitions were dismissed. Slaves could see the paradox. Thomas Jefferson, still in his early 30s, spoke of slavery as a moral evil, yet he was a prominent member of the Virginia slaveholding class. Now he was at work on a document about equality and liberty.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
If I were Jupiter looking at my childhood friend, Thomas Jefferson, knowing the world we both grew up in, I wouldn't be surprised by the contradictions that emerge in his thinking.
That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
In some ways, you know, Thomas Jefferson is so like America itself. Thomas Jefferson expresses opinions in the Declaration of Independence that are wonderful examples of fairness, of a belief in human dignity and human freedom. Yet Thomas Jefferson is so contradictory, because the man who writes the Declaration of Independence is the man that holds at one point almost 250 slaves or more. The country that says to the world we bring ourselves into existence on the principle of human freedom is the country that is in many ways founded on the principle of human slavery, supported by that principle.
That's a pretty substantial contradiction.
April 1775. Open warfare broke out. Black people began choosing sides. In the North, some 5,000 black men joined and mixed in all-black regiments to fight on the side of the Patriots. Some fought as Minutemen in the earliest battles of the war. Black soldiers were badly needed because some white colonists were reluctant to serve. Initially, General Washington resisted arming black men.
For white Americans everywhere, the image of a black soldier toting a gun evokes a totally disordered society, the complete disordering of the old society.
Washington relented when he heard what was happening further south. Word was spreading that the British were going to offer freedom to slaves who joined their side.
In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people who fled to the British, who joined his Ethiopian Corps.
It has a tremendous effect, and word spreads to other colonies.
They raided property and carried off cattle and clothing to deliver to British troops. They terrorized their former owners and kidnapped key Patriot farmers. Most importantly, they liberated their enslaved families and friends.
New York was the cockpit of the revolution. Colonel Tide was acting on a local level, but his actions had continental importance.
Dunmore's offer of freedom, coupled with the chaos of war, led to a mass exodus from southern plantations. Tens of thousands of slaves responded with their feet. The risks were huge.
There are tragic stories in Chesapeake Bay. Word is out that you can get on board a British ship. So you gather your family, 8 or 10 people in a small boat, you row out to the boat that's flying a British flag, only to find out that it's a hoax, that the Patriots have run up a British flag in order to lure you on board, arrest you, punish you, and send you back to the plantation. It's stories like that that break your heart.
Those slaves that reached the British forces were assigned the most arduous tasks: building fortifications, hauling heavy equipment, digging ditches. They lived in miserable conditions in military camps and died by the thousands of smallpox. At the end of the war, thousands of former slaves were transported to freedom by the British. Many others were freed by fighting for the Patriots. No other event until the Civil War would liberate so many slaves.
The point in all this is that whether African Americans fought for the American cause or whether they fought for the British cause, they were fighting for the central cause of freedom. That's what African Americans were fighting for. For them, the revolution really was a freedom struggle.
All men are born free and equal.
As the war was coming to an end, colonies began to write new constitutions.
The right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties. That of
In 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution was read aloud in every village, including Sheffield, where Mumbet did errands.
Their natural rights and blessings of life, and whenever these great objects are not.
Soon after, Mumbet knocked on the door of attorney Theodore Sedgwick. She knew him from the meetings at the Ashley House.
She overheard Ashley and his colleagues talking about the rhetoric of independence, talking about natural rights. Mumbet essentially says, we have this Constitution that appears to announce a principle of each person being free. If that is the case, then I am free.
Her meeting with Sedgwick led to a court suit in which Mumbet and another slave of the household sued Colonel Ashley for their freedom.
It wasn't just Theodore Sedgwick going against Colonel Ashley. He hired, Theodore did, some of the best legal talent that could be found in the whole southern New England.
In 1781, Mumbet won her case and announced that she would thereafter be known as Elizabeth Freeman. Her victory helped pave the way for the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts 2 years later. During the long hot summer of 1787, enslaved coachmen waited outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Inside, their owners forged the Constitution for the new republic.
The issue that was hardest for them to address was the issue of slavery. Then they simply postponed it all through that hot summer to the very end of their debates, and they finally brought it up and addressed it.
Most delegates, North and South, never considered eliminating slavery. It was clear any attempted abolition would have ended the effort to create the United States. While the deals around slavery would shape the national debate for the next 70 years, the words slave or slavery never appear in this founding document.
Now, they do refer to the institution in several indirect ways. There is the notion that the slave trade will not be abolished for at least 20 years. There is the notion that a person who owes service to a master in one state cannot escape that service by removing himself to another state. That's kind of a fugitive slave clause, but they don't use the word slave or slavery.
The most politically significant deal embraced by the Constitution was the 3/5 clause. It allowed states to count their slave population as 3/5 of a person in determining representation in Congress.
So the fact is, from the South's point of view, they are getting additional political power as a result of their slave population. Except for the 3/5 compromise, Jefferson would have lost that election in 1800. But the slaves are not being represented. The slaves get nothing from this.
And the republic that's created pays the price for that over the next many, many generations.
Black people were betrayed by the new Constitution, but if doors were shutting, they now looked for windows to open. 90% of blacks were still enslaved, but in northern cities, freed black communities were organizing themselves. In southern cities, black artisans were buying their freedom. Both groups ignited an emancipation movement. It began with the founding of the first black Christian churches.
It reinforced family and community. It provided the opportunity for men and women to exercise leadership roles.
Blacks had been slow to accept a religion that they associated with slavery and their masters. But in the mid-18th century, a Protestant revival movement called the Great Awakening introduced a more democratic and expressive form of Christianity, and some black people caught the spirit. Some slave owners, inspired by the values of the Great Awakening and the principles of the new nation, began to free their slaves. Not Thomas Jefferson. In the 1780s, Jefferson published his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia. In it, he argued against this great political and moral evil of slavery, yet at the same time he wrote that blacks were mentally inferior to whites.
It appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, in reason much inferior.
He suggests that they are not as bright, as smart, as intellectually gifted.
Jefferson's theories fueled both sides of the slavery debate, and while he wrote that black people should be free, he never used his power to free them, including during his presidency. Instead, he supported shipping former slaves to Africa.
Jefferson apparently believed that you could not have emancipation without having colonization, which is to say that we can't just let them be free here. That won't work. So if we are going to emancipate them, we have to send them somewhere else.
While some blacks supported colonization, most leaders in the freed black communities of the North denounced the idea.
You know, one of the things that these free blacks said is, I'm a citizen of the United States. My father, my grandfather, fought in the American Revolution to bring this nation into existence. I have as much right to be an American, to live in America, as anybody here.
The generation of blacks born in the late 18th century were raised on the promises of the Revolution and the frustrations of its aftermath. Among them was David Walker. Brought up in the South, Walker would move north to take the emerging abolitionist movement to another level. Walker was born free in the 1790s in Wilmington, North Carolina. He probably learned to read and write in one of Wilmington's first black Christian churches.
These are places which are not only religious places. These are places where political decisions are made, political meetings are held.
By roughly 1820, David Walker made his way to Charleston. There he was exposed to the ideas of Denmark Vesey. A freed carpenter, Vesey was a leader in the new African Methodist Episcopal Church.
David Walker learns from Denmark Vesey. The Bible could be a very, very important tool in giving blacks the strength to resist their enslavement. And he sees how the church in Charleston could be a center for organizing blacks just in terms of numbers and also ideologically rallying them.
Vesey, like many blacks enslaved and free, had also digested the news about the Haitian Revolution, the slave rebellion which created the first black republic. By 1822, while David Walker was in Charleston, Vesey was organizing a massive rebellion. But someone leaked it, and Vesey, along with more than 30 others, was executed. After that failed rebellion, Walker made his way to Boston. There he would discover not only a virulent racism against black men and women, but a growing political consciousness in the freed black community. In 1820s Boston, Walker became a leading voice in local black churches and organizations.
He is a member of the Massachusetts Colored Association, a black society specifically focused on abolition.
In 1829, Walker sat down to distill his experiences, his analysis of slavery, and his rage. He wrote what came to be known as the most important abolitionist document of the 19th century. He called it an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America.
This is an amazing document, and we can take it as the first maybe expression of black nationalism in this country. And basically, this is a verbal call to arms, asking the African American community to come together and empower itself.
America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears.
The appeal itself lays out the full history of argument against slavery, against slaveholding.
Oh, my colored brethren.
More than that, it is addressed to the colored people of America, saying to them that they have a single aspiration, and that single aspiration is freedom.
We must and shall be free.
Walker modeled the appeal on the Constitution, and he drew from the Declaration of Independence and the Bible.
He says Jefferson and America are hypocrites.
See your declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language?
He says that America is not doing what it professes to do. It is not expressing the values that it says it believes in.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Compare your own language above, extracted from your Declaration of Independence, with your cruelties and murders.
He says Christians are not living up to the values of Christianity.
In the appeal, Walker directly confronts Jefferson's arguments about black people in his notes on the state of Virginia.
Has Mr. Jefferson declared to the world that we are inferior to the whites?
He believed that racism had become so insidious that it was profoundly demoralizing blacks, making them incapable of acting against the terrible oppression which weighed on them. And his hope was that the appeal would serve to motivate African Americans to fight that.
One of the tremendous elements of David Walker's appeal is his reach into the psyche of blacks, to say first and foremost that we need to think together as a people, but also to focus on the individual, and in a sense to say change begins with you, and you must begin to think differently. Not only to think of us collectively as a single people sharing an ultimate aim of freedom, but to think of yourself differently, to think of yourself as an agent of freedom. And what Walker does in his appeal in 1829 is to say, listen, if emancipation is not forthcoming, blood will flow. Oceans and oceans of blood.
Americans, I call God, I call angels, I call men to witness that your destruction is at hand.
Walker distributed his appeal up and down the Atlantic seaboard. He mailed copies to ministers who would read it to the illiterate. The appeal was even discovered in the hands of runaways in North Carolina.
Black activists in the 1830s talk of gathering with others in their communities, to have the appeal read to them, to fire them, to give them increased inspiration to continue on with their struggle, and to help them understand what it was they were fighting.
Well, as you might well imagine, this is shocking and frightening to slaveholders. Immediately, many southern states put out bounties on David Walker's head. They want David Walker delivered from Massachusetts to a variety of places in the South. Of course, Southern slaveholders were well aware that there had been many slave rebellions and attempted rebellions all along, but this was particularly frightening because it was an appeal issued by a free black man outside of the South. In other words, outside of the direct control of slaveholders.
One of the people who responded to Walker's charge was the young Maria Stewart, who in 1826 married a free and successful Boston shipping agent. Born free, Maria was orphaned at age 5 and immediately sent into domestic service. She probably learned to read and write in a black church. 3 years after her wedding to James Stewart, he died.
Although he had been fairly prosperous, it turns out that upon his death, he had been defrauded by some white businessmen who were his colleagues. And so Maria Stewart was not only widowed, but also left destitute.
A year later, she received more devastating news. Her mentor, David Walker, was found dead in his Boston doorway.
There is reason to believe he may have been assassinated by someone operating on behalf of those people who felt directly threatened by his appeal for slave rebellion.
These compounding losses sparked a religious conversion with political implications.
She sees herself as picking up the torch from David Walker and carrying his work forward.
Stewart began to write and speak in public.
You see her speaking things such as, I committed myself to a life of virtue and piety, and I understood that I might be a warrior and a martyr for the cause of God and my brethren. Well, virtue and piety, perfectly reasonable. It was a woman's sphere. It was not a radical position at all. But then in the same sentence, here come the words warrior and martyr and God and my brethren.
Dark and dismal is the
Then
cloud that
she goes right on to say all of the nations of the world are crying out for freedom and independence. And can the sons of Africa remain silent under the heel of tyranny? And it's unprecedented in African-American intellectual history.
Why should man any longer deprive his fellow man of equal rights and privileges?
Maria Stewart was the first American woman to address a mixed audience of men and women about political issues. In its time, it was a bold and controversial act.
For Maria Stewart, the highest form of obedience to God was political protest.
Possess the spirit of independence.
Drawing inspiration from the Bible to oppose slavery, Stewart's special concern was the condition of black women.
How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury...
Drawing inspiration from the Bible to oppose slavery, Stewart's special concern was the condition of black women.
How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles?
In the early 1830s, Maria Stewart made a number of speeches to black organizations in Boston. In her passion to challenge her audiences to become leaders, she seemed to offend both the men and the women.
Throw off your fearfulness and come
She's
forward.
very, very hard on black men and accuses them of being servile, faithless, frivolous, passive.
And make yourselves useful and active members in society.
And make yourselves useful and active members in society.
And she's telling them to get up off their duffs and be active and to be men.
Be active and to be men.
Have the sons of Africa no souls? Feel they know ambitious desires?
But her words are very important, and that is, African Americans must depend foremost on themselves.
They must take the lead themselves. They must uplift the race.
That's the way they put it in the 19th century. They must uplift the race. And she was critical of anyone in African American community who was not working in every way possible to uplift the race.
David Walker and Maria Stewart are so important for African American history. In a sense, we could think of them as our founding father and mother. They're the first who have a sense of African American people as constituting almost a nation within a nation. We are a nation within a nation, and we need to figure out where we go from here.
They really foreshadow a coming, more militant generation. That generation will use the words, the sentiments, the strategies of Walker and Maria Stewart.
What David Walker and what Maria Stewart understood was that slavery and discrimination would not die as a result of moral persuasion or political activity, because they understood that the first abolitionist in America was the first black person brought off of a ship in chains. They understood only war would bring about the possibility of emancipation of blacks in America.